Why are so many professional players sticking to using outdated resolutions and aspect ratios, even when modern monitors and PC hardware can significantly improve the game's visual fidelity? Does a stretched 4:3 aspect ratio really give you such a big, significant competitive edge over your opponents? Or is it just a leftover habit from people growing up with older CRT monitors? To really grasp why these settings matter and the thought process behind pros' decisions and what you should use, we first need to understand how the monitor's pixel display interacts with the visual output of your video game. There are 3 scaling ratios you can use: native, stretched, and black bars, and they are determined by the aspect ratio and resolution of both your monitor and your game. The resolution of your monitor is the number of pixels that compose your monitor in both the height and the width, and the aspect ratio is the proportional relationship between those two dimensions. If your game perfectly matches your monitor in both the aspect ratio and the resolution, you are playing at the native settings. But this does not mean that the game has to be rendered at the same exact settings. If the game is rendered at a lower resolution, you now have more pixels on your monitor compared to the output of the game. The simplest option is just to use the monitor's pixels that match the in-game pixels while leaving the remaining pixels off or black. This is called using black bars. Let's visualize it with our fictitious monitor. It is 16 pixels wide and 9 pixels tall. If we are running it at native, we are also rendering the game at 16 by 9 pixels. But if we want to implement black bars, we can run the game at 12 by 9 pixels, where we will have 2 columns of unused pixels on either side, hence the black bars. The final option we have is something called stretched. While the previous options of native and black bars kept the pixels aspect ratio at a 1:1 scale, this option distorts the conversion from in-game to monitor pixels to fill the entire screen. But as you can see, this does distort the visual of the game, making everything slightly more stretched. Clearly, each of the scaling modes is different from one another, but what are the advantages and disadvantages to each, and which one should you use? With the native resolution, the game will look as the developer intended, having the highest clarity and definition. Every part of the game, from the models to the map and the HUD, will appear sharper. This is especially noticeable when looking at player models from far away, which will be now composed of more pixels at higher resolutions, allowing you to distinguish the body from the head more easily. However, this comes at the expense of a higher performance impact. The more pixels you need to render, the lower your FPS will be. Since you are stretching pixels horizontally in the stretched scaling modes, the main advantage is that everything on your screen will appear wider. While this does not actually change the sizes of the hitboxes on the server side, many people claim that this makes spotting enemies easier, improving your reaction time and reducing your time to kill. In addition to models, gaps as well will appear wider, and some people claim that makes hitting tight shots easier, such as someone jumping across the Dust 2 doors. But as all things in this world, we can't have the upsides without some downsides. Due to everything being stretched, everything moving on your screen horizontally will also appear slightly faster, and your sensitivity may feel off. If that doesn't make sense at first, consider this. You're looking at a gap that is 9 pixels wide on a native resolution. A box that is 1:1 pixel in size will take 3 seconds to cross, moving at a speed of about 3 pixels per second. Now let's replay this scenario at its stretched out resolution. The box, which was 1:1 at first, will now appear 2 pixels wide, but the time to cross has not changed. Crossing a gap that is now 18 pixels wide in 3 seconds will make the box appear like it's moving 6 pixels per second, doubling the apparent speed. It is for you to decide if the wider models are worth the increase in speed. And here's one more downside before you make your decision. Have you ever watched a pro match or spectated a teammate and they do this?
Traded places, but
And you wonder, how did they not see the enemy player? Well, this is what happens when you cut off the edges of your screen, which can still contain some important information, such as a whole entire enemy player. But what about black bars? They are a combination of all the downsides of native and stretched without much upside. You have regular sized models and still missing information on the edges. You may get a slight boost in FPS, and some people claim that they prefer to have less distractions when you have everything compressed towards the middle. Although, there is a pretty good reason why you have a very hard time finding any pros using black bars. But that was not always the case, and black bars have some historic usage. Until the early 2000s, most displays were CRT monitors, which were more square in aspect ratios, using resolutions such as 320 by 200, 1280 by 1024, or 1600 by 1200. And this is what most people played on. But as technology advanced, gaming LCD monitors started coming out with the more modern 16 by 9 aspect ratio, and players were faced with a choice: play native on the new aspect ratio or stick with black bars, because at the time, stretch was not really a thing. But why would you not switch to the native aspect ratio? The issue was that at the time, some games like Counter-Strike did not allow you to move your view model or HUD as you can do right now. And as a consequence, lineups that relied on those aspects of your screen would no longer be accurate. On top of this, LAN PCs were not as powerful as they are today, and some pros played with black bars to improve their FPS. But what is the meta now in the pro scene? As shown before, 75% of the pro scene uses stretch scaling modes, and 76% plays on the 4:3 aspect ratio. The most popular resolutions are 1280 by 960 with the usage of 53%, 1024 by 768 with the usage of 15%, and only then 1920 by 1080 at 13%, which would be considered native for many monitors. And then you have additional outliers. Some pros like Elige play 1680 by 1050, which is not a very popular resolution. So I decided to ask him to explain his thought process. He says that he started with 4:3 stretched, since that is what he grew up with playing in 1.6, and that he liked the feel of it. Up until 2016, he preferred that the models were bigger, but started trying different resolutions. First, he tried 1920 by 1080, since there were some other really good aimers trying it, but he never really liked it. It felt like the models were too thin, and he was moving very slowly. When trying 16 by 10, he said that it was a healthy medium between 4:3 stretched and 16 by 9, and that when he tried 4:3 again, it was a disadvantage FOV-wise, not being able to see a good amount of his screen, and that native is the best from an FOV perspective, where you can see the most, but says that if you don't have any of those feelings, or think the slower feel is a problem, then native is definitely the best option objectively. He does think that stretched has at least some merit, whereas black bars to him are completely useless. So then we return to the main question again. What should you use? While it depends on your personal preference, if the majority of the pros are anything to go by, playing on stretched at a lower resolution has advantages that outweigh the disadvantages, but only if you want to go for the wider models. Elige says that if you're just starting CS and have no preferences, he would go with either native or 1680 by 1050, his resolution. While switching settings is somewhat difficult to get used to, it is important to try various things to see what works best for you. If you are like me and have been playing on native 1920 by 1080 for over a decade, maybe give stretched a try. I know I will. And I will also make sure that I am not throwing my elo while getting used to these new settings. So I will be using the Refrag training modes to adjust to the new settings and sensitivity feel. Make sure to check out Refrag at refrag.gg.